Everyone and their grandma is launching a Bitcoin scaling solution over the past 12 months. It's been a super hot topic, especially because ordinals and runes, these new assets on the L1, have drawn fees to be bonkers. So I had to get someone on to help me break down what is going on in the space, how to look at it, and kind of break through the noise of what is and isn't an L2, a sidechain, Bitcoin layer, whatever you want to call it. So today I have Janusz on the podcast from Bitcoin Layers, which is a new website and research group that's doing exactly that, trying to break down what and how these things are constructed so you can go in knowing exactly what you're getting your kind of like hands in when you use some of these new L2s and scaling solutions. So we discuss a ton of topics around what is and isn't an L2. Are alt L2s currently just glorified multi-sigs? And a bunch of other topics that I think you're really going to enjoy. So, without further ado, let's jump into this great conversation with Janusz from Bitcoin Layers.
Welcome to Built on Bitcoin.
Janusz, how you doing today, my man?
Doing good. Excited to be on the podcast. Yeah, doing good. How about yourself?
I am, first of all, excited to have you, which you guys have been cooking and doing much needed research and kind of breaking down the mystique of L2s. Super important. So, thank you for what you're doing.
Yeah, of
Yeah,
course.
excited to chat. We briefly connected in Denver when Bitcoin painted East Denver orange, and there was the Bitcoin Renaissance event that was fantastic. Um, so that was cool to connect with you. I want to open with just a banger. Just go straight into the conversation, and then we'll kind of dance around. So, first question is: there's this huge topic of Bitcoin L2s. They're a big thesis right now,
hmm
and if you listen to some of the more wise people, they'll say all L2s are just glorified multisigs if you get down to brass tacks. So help us unpack that. Like, is that a true statement? What's true, what's false? Like, break that down for us.
Yeah, so that's a true statement. When you look at, when you're entering and depositing funds into any of these types of side chains or L2s, you're essentially depositing funds into a multi-sig. Now, the design of the multi-sig varies from the various types of L2 or sidechain protocol. So, for example, for a payment channel, you're depositing the funds into a 2-2 multisig with your counterparty. That's what you're doing within the Lightning Network if you're running your own Lightning node and participating in that network self-custodially. If you're depositing funds into Rootstock, you're depositing into a federation known as the PowPeg, which I think has 11 signers. Liquid has a similar federation model of 15 signers. Stacks has a couple of different, multi-sigs that are operated by companies. So there's like 2 to 3 or five signers for each of those multi-sigs. So this is what you're essentially doing. You're depositing funds into a multi-sig. The difference is when you're looking at these protocols is who is signing and permitting the withdrawal requests, and do you have any sovereignty over your funds? So in Lightning, for example, you would have sovereignty over your funds, and you can close a channel and withdraw funds back to the main chain collectively with your counterparty. And then in these other multi-sig designs, from a sidechain perspective, you are effectively giving up complete sovereignty and control of your assets to this, group of people who are responsible with keeping custody of the Bitcoin and minting the relevant synthetic on the sidechain. And if you wanted to leave the sidechain, you would have to put a request to this federation, and then that's how you would withdraw your funds. Yeah, and spend a lot of my time looking at these newer constructions that have been popping up over the last year. And those are similar. They're all multi-sigs, and you're trusting some federation with the custody of your funds in these new types of constructions.
Yep. Okay. So that's probably the first thing to double click on when we're talking about L2s. Actually, maybe we should define. So, like, how do you define L2? Because there's L2, there's Bitcoin layers, there's side chains. Let's do a brief overview of terms real quick before we go any deeper.
Okay. Yeah, so there's a couple of definitions for L2s, and I think they're all useful to explore. I think there's 3 to 4 different camps. So I mean, I think there's 4 camps, but I might only like, yeah, let's just go over all of them. The first camp is the unilateral exit camp. And that has now even been split into two different parties. So for example, you have, if you deposit funds into the L2, all you need to do is initiate an L1 transaction to leave the L2 and reclaim your funds on the main chain. That is like traditionally the definition for unilateral exit. Someone added a caveat to that and was like, well, yeah, you also need to ensure that the operators of the L2 cannot commit fraud or collude with some party to steal the funds. So like, for example, like in state chains, you can unilaterally exit whenever you want, but there is some, mechanism to where the operator of the state chain, that federation or single party could collude with various parties in the network and steal your funds. So that is where like there's a distinction there. So it's like one distinction is just unilateral exit. So things like state chains would be included, Lightning, etc. And then there's another classification, which would likely just be Lightning, where it's like only, it's unilateral exit and there's no like central operator that can steal your funds. And there's no like challenge mechanism to where you as a user, like if your funds are stolen, like there's no way for you to like challenge that and try to get them back. So that's like the first kind of distinction between the unilateral exit camps. And then there's another camp that's like, well, unilateral exit might not be really sustainable long term, so maybe we should just consider things like, really decentralized side chains or improved side chain designs as L2s. So things like the Spider chain, which Botanix is developing, I guess things like drive chains would be considered L2s within this context. The type of sidechain designs that people are trying to design with like BitVM style bridges would be L2s within this context. So that's another camp, and that would additionally include everything within the unilateral exit camp. And then the third camp is like taking that a step further and saying any type of sidechain that has a dependency on Bitcoin would be considered an L2. So that's things like Rootstock, I guess Liquid would be included there, and then even something like Stacks would be included. But there's a further division there. Like some people would say Rootstock is an L2 and then Stacks is not, because Stacks relies on an alternative token for network security. So there's another distinction there. And then like I'd say the final camp is kind of everything's an L2. So things like eCash, Fedimints, even things like Coinbase would be considered L2s because they're a separate protocol or a separate system that you can deposit your funds to and unlock some like new types of functionalities. So those are like the broader definitions, I would say, of L2s. We kind of took the stance early on in our docs that only like Lightning, maybe state chains were L2s. And the reason we did that was because we wanted to kind of put a line in the sand and be pretty conservative, because we didn't know what was going on with all these new protocols. Like we didn't know what their designs were. We didn't know what their constructions were, if their claims that they were making were true. So we put a line in the sand and said, if it doesn't enable unilateral exit, it's not an L2. We've since stated that we're not really trying to classify these things as L2s or not, and just like analyze them against like a specific framework. But we are working on some materials right now to outline these different types of definitions to at least show people like, hey, these are kind of the 4 camps, like pick your camp, like these are the 4 camps. These are why people think these things are L2s, and kind of, yeah, put yourself in one, pick the definition that you feel is best. And then for us, we still, within any of these definitions, we still have a generalized framework that we can analyze any protocol against. Independent if it's an L2 or not. So we're trying to analyze things like Lightning against things like validity rollups, for example. And that's kind of difficult, and it's difficult to find like a framework that fits all of those things, but I think we're doing a relatively good job of that. And yeah, so that's why we're not trying to specifically define an L2, but those are like the 4 definitions that I think people would give you. And even within those 4 definitions, as you just saw, there's even like splits in between them and how you can define that. So I think that, yeah, that's kind of my understanding of the situation right now.
Cool. Okay. No, that's helpful. And yeah, it's kind of been my pulse on it too, is like I guess the reason why I don't like the term L2 to define just Lightning is it makes everything else like murky mess that everyone can just self-define and
Mhm.
identify as. So like I like what you guys are doing because it show you're kind of defining other terms and then you can append them to so like you have a definition of what federation might mean or what custodial might mean, for example, and then you can just bolt those on to a specific sidechain or layer, and you can go, okay, cool, Coinbase has a blah blah blah, Rusok has a blah blah blah, and people can like look. You can open a little book and look at the definition of those words and then and define it. It does seem like part of the pushback here. So I'm looking at the four you've defined, and like especially when you go into like the Coinbase exchange route, it's like one camp leans into L2 means minimal trust assumptions, and so my Bitcoin's always safe. And the other side is a place where BTC, the asset, becomes more expansive in its use cases, and they're optimizing for different things.
Yeah. I mean, I think though, like the issue that so this is an interesting point, right? Like I feel I sympathize. Like I saw this on Twitter once. Like I was arguing with someone, and they were like basically like, "Hey, like we've called Liquid an L2 for years, and like now all the Ethereum people are coming to Bitcoin, and they want to like change the definition, and they want to add new opcodes and enable new types of L2s because that fits like their definition, right?" And I sympathize with that view of like, hey, we've traditionally like called sidechains L2s and like, there's not much of a problem with that. And I'm okay with trusting the 15 Federation members of Liquid with the custody of my assets because there's this huge reputational risk associated with them acting maliciously. Um, and I think that's fine, right? Like I think that's totally fine. Like, and that's why I think like defining the term L2 is just like it's never gonna end. And even in Ethereum now, they're trying to say like roll-ups are L2s and Validiums aren't L2s, and then like people who
Yeah.
say Validiums are L2s or like Optimiums aren't L2s, and because there's this collusion attack that the sequencer and the DA layer can do, and it's like you're never gonna be able to stop the semantics war. So the reason we're not trying to like specifically define it anymore is just because of that. Like because we say one thing and then something will change and then maybe we get new like opcodes and better bridging models and then we get new types of L2s and then you have this like gray area of like, oh, is an optimistic roll-up style blockchain that uses a data availability committee with like five members, is that an L2, right? And then you get into these like, in these more debates. And like I just feel like, yeah, like we'll always be a part of the discussion, I think, and always try to do our best to help point people towards like, hey, an L2 should be something that inherits like security from the base layer and has some very robust mechanism that's securing the assets that are like being deposited into the L2. But I think trying to like specifically define it as one thing is always going to be a battle. And I think everyone, because people have, interests and they have products and they have things they want to pitch and they want, those things to be adopted and they want them to be kind of like known as they want in like terms of like marketing language, you want to be able to describe your solution in a way that's familiar with people, and L2 is a term that people are familiar with, and that's why people are using it because it makes sense. It's like, oh, I deposit my money into this thing and I unlock all these new types of functionalities and I also maybe get some like scaling benefits, for example. So I think that's why people use the term. I disagree with it, but that's totally fine. And like, I don't think I'm going to change anybody's mind, right? Like, I don't think that's kind of the game we're in. I think we're just trying to tell users and other participants in the ecosystem, like, hey, these are the risks that are associated with these types of things.
Yep, makes sense. Okay, then maybe to add some more color here. There, it's like there's two pieces to an L2 or a layer. There's like the
Mhm.
peg mechanism, which is very hard to solve. It's kind of where most of the uh, friction is currently as far as trust assumptions, for example. But then you have once your coins are bridged over and they're locked on the L1, you can do all kinds of things on the actual blockchain or peer-to-peer network, depending what network you're using. And that has a whole
Mhm.
different design space. But it seems like most people kind of combine the two. So it's like there's some kind of bridge, and then you just happen to go over to Bob, for example. There's some kind of bridge, and then you go into Merlin, and they're just like conjoined. So I'd love for you to give us some color on like how these two pieces are kind of like, are they two separate entities and they should be thought of separate, or are they kind of two interwoven pieces?
like the different like the bridge and yeah.
And the actual
So
blockchain, yeah.
yeah, so this is a great question. So like let's use Bob for for an example. Bob, there's a couple of ways you can deposit BTC into Bob currently. So if you're not familiar, Bob is this construction that they have a roll up on Ethereum, and they're trying to essentially abstract all the way the complexity of using Bitcoin within this like Ethereum roll up. And it kind of acts as like an application chain. So think of just like a roll up that's specifically dedicated for Bitcoin use cases. So ordinals, BRC20 trading, payments, even whatever. So when you deposit Bitcoin into Bob, there's basically two different synthetics they use. They have TBTC, which is secured by the threshold two-way peg mechanism, which has its own set of trust assumptions. And then you have WBTC, which is secured by a centralized company. So in either of these models, the people that are operating the two-way pegs are different from the people that are operating the Bob blockchain. So the Bob blockchain is essentially run by the company that created it. So whatever the company that created Bob was called, they're running this thing called a sequencer, which is essentially a centralized node that is including and ordering all the transactions that are submitted to the rollup by users, and then it's taking a block, executing it, and then posting a state change to the L1. And then that state change will like allow users, like if they wanted to withdraw their funds, they could then like withdraw their funds based on the most recent state transition that was posted by the sequencer. And they have a security mechanism that they're going to be implementing on all these OP stack chains, notice fraud proofs that allow like some actors to dispute, because the sequencer can like basically post whatever it wants. Because it's centralized. It can even post like a fraudulent state root that's like, oh, I'm going to steal everybody's funds. So you need some like security mechanism to say like, oh, we're going to reject that because we don't want like the centralized party to steal everybody's money. So in that construction, right, like the operators of the chain are different from the people and the parties that are managing the multi-sig. But if you look at something like Liquid, it's my understanding that the functionaries within Liquid who are managing this two-way peg are also the parties responsible with proposing and signing Liquid blocks. So when you submit transactions that get included in the block, the people that are collectively signing this block and saying and adding it to the chain are the 15 parties that are also responsible for the two-way peg. So it varies by implementation, and I think looking at all of these different chains. You have to look at, and most are relatively honest. Like they'll say like, oh, these are the people that are like operating the two-way peg. And like if you go to Bob, for example, it has an entire list of like all the trust assumptions that you're taking on when you're interacting with the chain, and what are the addresses for all these like relevant roles, like the sequencer and the proposer and the challenger and the multi-sig that's responsible with upgrading like the bridge contract, for example. Like it has all these roles listed in this documentation, and you can go verify it by looking at the chain. So yeah, so it depends on like which implementation you're looking at for these various like roles in because yeah, there's like a lot of different properties and so what I'm looking for. Yeah, a lot of different actions that are being done on these chains, like securing the funds, proposing state changes, challenging state changes if need be, what's hosting the data relevant to the chain. So yeah, the roles vary by the implementation.
Got it. Okay. And yeah, I actually haven't thought about that, but there's an interesting question about um, separating block production and what we typically call mining with multi-sig control and control of funds. I'm gonna put a pin in that for a second. I want to loop into kind of
Okay.
what you guys are doing at Bitcoin layers. We'll probably loop back into that. But recently, you announced that you're starting this research group called Bitcoin Layers. You've raised some funding, it sounds like. So yeah, talk to us about what this is, and maybe we could dovetail that into. You guys do have some criteria for how you judge different side chains, different L2s. So talk to us about that.
Yeah, so I'm working on the company's called LX Research Labs, and this company has raised a small amount of funding from UTXO Management, which is a VC firm in the Bitcoin space. And the project that we're dedicating all of our current funding and resources to is this project called Bitcoin Layers, which is an open source platform under the MIT license. And essentially, we are analyzing all of these different types of side chains and L2 implementations against a generic framework that we've created. Um, and the framework is that we look at essentially a few different things when we're analyzing this chain. So we have like this main risk analysis section. And this section is based on, okay, the first thing we're looking at is who's custodying the funds related to the multi-sig. So are you, like with Lightning, entering like a 2 of 2 multi-sig with a counterparty? Are you depositing funds into a multi-sig where it's like 15 signers that are all like, you're trusting them on their reputation? Is there some alternative token involved? And is there some slashing mechanism in place if like the signers of the multi-sig try to steal the funds? Is that token, the collateralization of that token, greater than the funds that are stored in the multi-sig, etc.? So we're kind of like, that's the first thing we look at. The next things we look at is data availability. So if you if you're publishing a relevant state change to the L2, who are the parties responsible for that? Who are the parties responsible for kind of storing that data and making it available in the event that it needs to be made available? Is it Bitcoin full nodes? Are you hosting it yourself on your own server? Is it a centralized party? Is it another consensus mechanism? Is it a federation, etc.? And then you look at same thing with settlement assurances. Like, are the settlement assurances guaranteed by Bitcoin? The settlement happen on Bitcoin? Is that settlement optimistic in any way? And then you just kind of go again down the ladder. Is it another consensus mechanism that provides settlement and finality? Is it a centralized party federation, etc.? And then the last thing that we're looking at is essentially something related to like liveness. So who's operating the chain? So is it a centralized sequencer? Is it another consensus mechanism? Is it a federation, etc.? So we're basically taking these like 4 different things and we're looking at them and saying like, okay, like what are the trust assumptions that a user is taking on with these each individual aspects of interacting with the L2? So for example, if you have something like, again, Bob's like actually a really good example to illustrate this. So like Bob is posting, its sequencer is posting sequencer batches. So this batch of transactions that include the state and the relevant state changes for the rollup, they're posting that to Ethereum. So like that's a decentralized consensus protocol. It has pretty good security properties compared to other things. So like that is actually like a pretty robust data availability solution. But then you look at like, for example, it's also operated by a centralized sequencer. So like in Bob, I think you can include your transaction in a sequence. So you can like bypass the sequencer if it censors you, but you can't propose your own state transition and withdraw funds from Bob in the event that like the proposer and the sequencer censor you. So there's like these 2 centralized rules with regards to like the operation of the network, the specific chain. So it's like you have to document that, and there's like nuances around that. And then looking at like the custody of funds, like again, who are the various parties responsible for these various bridge mechanisms? We typically only look at like, so for example, like some of these chains launch like their own native bridge, but we also mention potentially like, oh, here's the trust assumption of the native bridge, here are the signers in the multi-sig. There might be this other like centralized bridge that you can also use. So we're basically taking those 4 categories and like analyzing them and just giving them like a high, low, or medium risk score, and we outline the various circumstances that put a chain specifically in each score within each of those categories. And then we further look at another 5 questions. And is the chain contributing to the security budget? What's the mechanism for withdrawals? Does it introduce MEV on the Bitcoin base layer or the second layer protocol? And then we're looking at, forgetting the other 2 things we're looking at. It's a lot. So MEV,
It's very thorough.
it's MEV, it's withdrawals, it's see, I've even forgotten the third one I just mentioned. Yeah, but we're asking like another 5 questions related to the security assumptions of the protocol, and we're like diving into those things specifically. And we do this for every chain. So for like Lightning, for example, it received like a low risk score across all the categories, because ultimately if you use Lightning in a self-custodial way, and you are able to like keep your node on at all times and be and interact with your counterparty, etc. Like you have relatively good trust assumptions. And then like if you look at something, for example, like Liquid, you're completely been trusting a lot of basically every function of the chain with this like federation of like 50 parties. You can run your own node in Liquid, but you're also like trusting the federation like with the ability to like allow you because they use this thing called like bridge nodes, which is quite interesting. But yeah, so like the trust assumptions for these two different models are like very distinct. So when we're looking at these things, we're essentially outlining like, hey, like these are the parties that you're trusting when you're interacting like with these specific layer two protocols.
Very interesting. Okay, so to rehash, the big four are how the funds are custodied, um, data availability, and is data availability, it's a term I keep hearing. Basically, that's where data is stored to reconstruct the current state. Is that a way to think about it?
Yeah, it's there's some nuance with it. Like I know people like there's this idea that data storage and data availability are two different things, but
Mm,
um my understanding, yeah, how we've referred to it in Bitcoin at least is like, yeah, like in the validity rollups paper, it's described as like being able to post a state root and enough transaction data to the Bitcoin network. So in the event that you needed to reconstruct the state, you could like go to the Bitcoin full nodes and they can make that data available so you could reconstruct the state of the blockchain from Genesis based on the data that is stored or published or made available by the specific mechanism that the chain uses. So in the case of a rollup, that would be Bitcoin.
got it.
So data availability, yeah.
And then thinking here is something like the reason we do decentralization is because if, say governments come and try to attack the network and they start taking down nodes, if you if that data is available to recreate easily, then you can just keep spinning up other copies, and it's like it becomes this hydra you can't stop. That's kind of the idea.
Yeah, it's essentially right. Like the reason, yeah, you don't want the data like with related to your chain to be like lost forever because you wouldn't be able to like reconstruct state and the chain wouldn't be able to like make progress. So like if you're a roll up and the Bitcoin network, which is extremely unlikely, but completely goes offline, then there's no way for you to make progress as a chain because the data essentially is gone and you can't build upon the previous state. A good way to look at this in another kind of example is when you look at something like an optimium is essentially a roll-up style blockchain that would use a fraud-proof mechanism for security. So if the sequencer posted a malicious state transition, then you would have parties who are able to submit fraud proofs to contest that state transition. In the event that like, and it uses an off-chain data availability system. So this is interesting because like in this mechanism, if like say let's say the data availability system is just like a 3 of 5 multi-sig, which is very common in like Ethereum. Like these models of like 3 of 5 multi-sigs for data availability committees is like actually quite common, or 5 of 8 multi-sig, etc. If this thing withholds the data and colludes with the sequencer, and the sequencer posts a malicious state transition to steal everybody's funds, the fraud provers can't submit fraud proofs because they're not able to submit a fraud proof because they don't have access to the data. So they can't contest it because they don't have access to a previous state, like a state transition, to say like, oh yeah, like this is an fraudulent state root, and the users didn't actually like submit these transactions to like give it all to the sequencer. So there's other reasons why you would want like a robust data availability system in a lot of these designs.
Got it. Okay. And there's two more I want to touch on just to make sure I got it right. But you actually brought up, you make me think of a second question, which is I can kind of tell you came from the ETH side of things and you've come back to Bitcoin recently. I could be off there, but that's my assumption. And I say that because a lot of people on the ETH side, they know what these terms optimium, validium even mean. And a lot of Bitcoiners we're so new to rollups that we definitely don't know the different kinds of rollups. And so
Mhm.
um, the one question here is like, given the current state of Bitcoin layers, is it in a Bitcoiner's best interest right now to understand these things of validiums and optimiums and know the difference, or can we just go to Bitcoin layers and get 90% of it and not have to go in the weeds and understand these things?
Yeah, this is a great question. Yeah, so I used to work on an Ethereum project So that's why I'm a little bit more exposed to these things, and kind of understand them. And I think the way we're trying to do it is we're basically trying to say like, hey, these are like, and we explain like, yeah, so if like there's a centralized sequencer and you can force an exit, and basically your trust assumption is like, yeah, in the worst case, you can submit an L1 transaction and leave. Like we explain that. It's like, hey, there's a centralized party. It does all the block production. If it centers you, you can leave with an L1 transaction. And like ultimately your trust assumption is like, can you afford an L1 transaction? Um, so we try to basically outline that as like simply as possible. So I think like in terms of like the specific definitions, like I don't think they matter that much. Like the reason, for example, we use them is like there's like specific chains that will call themselves roll-ups, but they're not roll-ups. Like they're not inheriting consensus and using like using Bitcoin for data availability. So it's like, okay, it's essentially this is another construction that might have this like trust minimized two-way peg or like a two-way peg design with Bitcoin, but it's not inheriting any security at all right now, especially in like the current state of like Bitcoin multi-sigs and Bitcoin two-way pegs. Like it's not inheriting any security from Bitcoin. These like things that are calling themselves roll-ups. So we call them like we do some reviews on these things and we're like, hey, eventually this might be like a Validium type blockchain, and we're gonna add like hyperlinks and hovers to say like oh yeah, if you hover over it, it'll say like what a Validium is. But like ultimately it doesn't really matter like what these specific definitions mean. We just kind of put them there to like put a check on a lot of the projects. Like if you're calling yourself a ZK rollup, like, and you're not a ZK rollup, like we're going to point that
Mm.
out, and we're not going to call you a rollup just because like a lot of the projects we're doing right now claim to be rollups and they're just side chains, and we just say like, yeah, it's a side chain, like it's not a rollup. And we try to like, yeah, just tell people what it actually is, and if they're interested, they can learn more about it.
Okay. And then so yeah, custody of fund, going back to the big four, custody of funds, data
Okay,
availability.
I'm
Um
pulling it
we're,
up here
we're
too.
yeah, we're dancing. So the other two, to make sure I got that right, one was settlement assurances and the other was liveness.
Yep.
Do I have that right? And
Yeah,
so what is
liveness.
yeah, so settlement assurances is what is that? Like confirmation I send a transaction it will get included in a block, or what does that mean?
So essentially, settlement assurance is like when who's dictating like finality, right? So like in a roll
Mm,
up, theoretically, you would submit your transactions to the sequencer, and then the sequencer would post the state transition to Bitcoin, and then that would be like done in like the form of like an inscription, and then a Bitcoin block would like accept that transaction, and your transaction in the roll up is considered ultimately final when it's included in when the state transition when a transaction including the state transition is finalized in a Bitcoin block. So your finality is ultimately dependent on Bitcoin, but you're getting this like soft finality mechanism, so you don't have to like wait all day. Like you don't have to wait like the 10, 20, 30 minutes for your transaction to confirm. You just take the 2-second confirmation because you trust the sequencer, and then it eventually finalizes on Bitcoin. If like in Lightning, for example, like your transactions aren't final, basically until you close your channel, and you're doing that on the L1, so that's like Bitcoin finality. Like you're closing a channel with a counterparty, Bitcoins, yeah, you do that. You close the channel, and then your transactions are considered final. In a side chain like Rootstock, for example, your settlement assurances are guaranteed by the miners who are mining rootstock, and then when your transaction is included in the block and that block is finalized, then your transaction is considered final. So that's basically what we're trying to define with settlement assurance, and that's going to get a lot more interesting when we start seeing like more roll-ups and roll-up like blockchains. I think right now it's pretty much like your settlement is guaranteed, other than Lightning, your settlement's like being guaranteed for the things we reviewed. Your settlement is being guaranteed by an alternative consensus mechanism.
got it. And then liveness. I didn't grasp that one.
So this is essentially like so for example, we do network operator in the sense of like um, this is really related to censorship. So again, this is kind of more specific to like roll up constructions. So like for example, in a roll up, and it's relevant to side chains too, right? Because if you have a federated side chain and its federation is 15 members, and that's the members that are, signing and proposing blocks, like if 12 of them go down, then the chain's down, right? Like, so you're reliant on like some majority or some percentage of this federation to stay online and having the chain make progress or include your transactions in the blocks because they could censor you if they get like if there's some court order and like the company who manages the chain like tells all the federation members like, hey, like don't include these transactions anymore because the government said so, right? That's a censorship issue, and if you can't withdraw your funds or you can't make progress, then like you're effectively stuck, right? In a roll up, this is interesting because like some roll-ups will have like a centralized sequencer. They'll allow you to unilaterally exit. Some roll-ups won't. So if you get censored by the sequencer, like you can't withdraw and you're stuck. If the transaction fees are really, really high in the L1, and let's say like they're $100 to like do an exit and you only have $50 in the roll-up, like if you get censored by the centralized party, then you effectively you've lost your money. So what we mean by liveness and network operators is we're essentially saying like, is the chain always making progress, and what is the percentage, what is the chance that like, or who are the parties that could potentially censor you if they don't want your transaction to get included? So that's kind of what we mean by that.
Got it. Okay. So yeah, on
And
Liquid,
there's no,
go ahead.
yeah, go ahead, sorry. Yeah, and
No,
there's
it's
a
good.
nuance to that, right? Like, yeah, because the roll-ups have like a centralized sequencer, but then they'll argue like it's the L1 ultimately that like determines ordering and consensus, and then like the side chains will be
Mm,
like, oh no, like you need to have like decentralized parties proposing and signing blocks because the centralized sequencer can censor you and it can go offline, and like there's a lot of nuances to this stuff.
I see. I see. Yep. So on Liquid, it's the Federation that's doing block production. On Stacks, that's however many miners are currently mining on the network that's giving forward progress.
Hmm.
On on Lightning, it's channel based, so it could be just me and you talking. But the way that
Hmm.
people typically expect Lightning to work, could we add LSPs as kind of a liveness aspect? Like if some big LSPs went down,
Hmm.
a lot of routing routes go down as well. So like, is that where there's more nuance here as well?
Yeah, so like for that example, like specifically to like LSPs, we put that in like the use cases example. So like we kind of cover Lightning in the event of like you're like you have like these various like channels with all these different people, and you have like your own node and like you're managing all the channels and managing all the liquidity requirements. Like specifically to LSPs, we like put that in the use cases and then kind of mention like this there might be an additional trust assumption related to this. And
Got it.
this is the reason why people will take it because it provides better user experience.
Very cool. Okay. So yeah, we have the criteria down pretty well, and the criteria is pretty objective, so you can kind of like judge each sidechain according to this criteria. The next kind of difficult question that someone has to go through is like, okay, I see the criteria. I have to make a judgment call based on these 5 to 10 things on where I'm willing to put my money. So, given that you're in the weeds here, like who's doing the best trade-offs of all these different criterias? And this kind of dovetails in maybe into like this block
Yeah.
production versus multi-sig. Like, is it better to have them separated? Is it better to have them together? Like, what's the best L2 out there right now is the underlying question.
Yeah.
But yeah,
Um, I this is an interesting question. So I think the what we're trying to say is like so for example, like the way I interact with Bitcoin the most is via Fedimints. So I have like my Mutiny wallet and I pick a excuse me, and I pick a federation that is responsible for like holding my funds, whatever. And like I'm cool with that. And I know it's a federation and I have seen like some thumbs up votes on it, and I'm like, fine, that's cool. Because I'm only like putting a minimal amount of money into that wallet and recycling it, relatively quick, like relatively frequently, so I can like pay for stuff with Lightning. Um, so like in my opinion, right, like it's not essentially that like users shouldn't they shouldn't, they should avoid everything that's like a federated multi-sig or a centralized protocol or a centralized, server or whatever. It's just like understand that that's what you're interacting with. I think the problem that we have right now is that like some protocols like Fedimint and eCash specifically are being like very honest and like this is the trust assumption. Like you go into their docs and it's like this is who you're trusting, and this is like these are your counterparties within this like respective system. And then you look at like these new projects and they're like trustless, trust minimized, and like we have this decentralized thing, and it's like okay, when you get down into it, it's a multi-sig. Um, so when you look at like these new layer two designs, I would say ultimately, right, it depends on your use case. Like if you want to like go and play the casino and yeet shit coins and do whatever, then using something like a centralized kind of roll up on another blockchain or a centralized side chain that provides that functionality and provides that execution layer, then like that's totally fine. Like do your thing. But just understand that like you can get rugged at any moment and like there could be a hack and like the bridge operator could like have some bad OPSEC and like you could lose your funds at any moment, right? So that's like the big thing there. And it's like, yeah, so like outlining that. With regards to your question on like should you decouple the operators of the multi-sig and the chain, in most of the current implementations of these new side chains, that's not typically the case. Like I think things like stacks, rootstock, etc., are different. But like when you look at like these newer constructions, is they're all multi-sigs that have the network that's also operated by like a centralized company and centralized party. So they're kind of together. But an interesting point is like so specific to like Fedimints, a lot of people don't know this, but like um you can create like EVM style execution environments in a Fedimint module, just no one's done it yet. And like when I was talking to their team about this, just like theoretically, just thinking about this, like, oh, could you do this, right? And they're like, yeah, if it's written in Rust, like go for it. Um, and I asked the question, like, could you, because Fedimints operate in this weird way where they have like some async consensus protocol also involved. And that's like I said, theoretically, could you make the consensus protocol have more participants than the multi-sig itself? And they were like, yeah, but why would you do that? Because like ultimately the trust assumption is with the bridge. Like so in any event, even if you have the most decentralized consensus network and decentralized block production scheme, and you have all these like various roles and they're all permissionless, whatever, and you have the best security model possible, like the trust assumption still relies with the parties that you're entrusting with your assets. So I think like in the meantime, teams are going to try and like front run like the ability to construct better two-way pegs by decentralizing their architectures. And then they're going to essentially take an improved two-way peg design and then, add that when it's like ready, if that makes sense. Um, I still think though that like, and this is a problem that I do have with our risk assessments that I would like to figure out how we could change is like ultimately the biggest security assumption that you're taking with any of these changes, who custodies the funds that you're depositing into it. And at the end of the day, most of them are just federations, and you have to trust that specific federation. And like for me, I would trust a Fedimint run by certain groups of people, Fedimints by friends, whatever, some eCashmints perhaps, and then like Liquid, the rootstock Powpeg, I think has been like around for a while, has like a good reputation, right? That like personally for me, like that's kind of where I'm at. And then I play around with all these other chains just to like see the user experience and see what it's like. And I think it ultimately just depends on the person, right? Like I'm not super into like using quote unquote DeFi products, but if you are, then you might want to trust one of these multi-sigs because there's some cool apps that you can use related to the chain that they're on, and that's the trust assumption. So as long as you know that, then you're totally good. I think the issue is it's like that's the problem right now is I don't think many people. Well, I think many people either don't know that, and I also think a lot of people don't care, right? Like people like Blast, for example, in Ethereum is just like this completely centralized multi-sig scheme that they then launched a chain, and the chain like got hacked, and then like the operators of the chain could upgrade the contract, basically the roll-up contract, and basically reverse the state to like erase the hack from history. And everyone was like, oh well, if you do that, like then you have no chance of credibly being decentralized ever. And it's like, no, this is ridiculous. Like it's a completely centralized chain. We know it's
Yeah.
centralized. Like reverse it, right? Like there's no reason to play decentralization theater when you have like $80 million hacked in your protocol. If you can reverse it, right? Like so I think that's the other thing too, is like I think a lot of this does come down to like decentralization theater at times. And it's like, look, if you're
Yeah.
not a decentralized thing and you're not trying to be like it's cool, just let people know that.
Yeah. No, I think that's, yeah, great points. You do see that there's two big camps. There's like the degens who want to chase yield and chase number go up, and they'll take on super high risk for, going to a centralized chain, for example. And then you have the trust list maxis that want to, keep their coins safe as shit and never give anybody anything, especially the government, but not even their neighbor. And that's like when I talked to Cody Lowe from Fedimint, that was what kind of opened my eyes to Fedimints is that I think he called it like the wallet test or like the $20 test. Like who would you give 20 bucks to? Like a home 20 bucks that they would pay it back. It's like the homeless guy on the corner, not going to pay you back. That's a donation. So you don't trust your funds on that Fedimint. But your neighbor, there's things about your neighbor that you can kind of trust to get your money back. Geographically defined. You see them every day. These kind of
Hmm.
things. So this idea of it's almost like the idea of trustlessness that we have. Some people have on like a pinnacle. It's like it's a good North Star, but it shouldn't be the standard because trust is so imbued into everything we do every day. It's why our bullshit detectors are so good because we can kind of suss
Hmm.
out who's faking us. And so there's something about Fedimints that's very practical once you know the trust assumptions involved. As long as they're clear, it's a pretty good path forward.
Yeah, and I think too, like again, right? Like this is where I probably have come to with kind of my time in the space is that when you look at Bitcoin and you look at all these different proposals, like ultimately the thing I wanted was like a Zcash style like execution environment on Bitcoin. And what got me interested in doing that on Bitcoin was like potentially like a validity roll up, right? That was kind of like how I like really started paying attention to like a lot of this like new stuff on Bitcoin that's coming up. And that was like my ultimate like interest, right? So I thought about like decentralized sequencers and decentralized provers and decentralized like upgrading mechanisms for the roll up and like how can we ensure that users can always get their transaction included because Zcash transactions might one day get like banned because they're privacy oriented, right? So you need like decentralized infrastructure for that type of like system. But then so I always approached it from like how can we maximally like decentralize these systems? And it's funny because I actually like started learning about like Fedimints in like 2022, I think is when I got interested in them because I heard it at a conference. And then I went away from them and I was like, oh no, we need like maximally scalable, maximally decentralized, like maximally um, trustless systems. And then when you look at like how these things are getting constructed today, like when you talk to the developers and talk to the people like around rollups and sidechains, like they do acknowledge like, yeah, there are a lot of like um there's a lot of roadblocks and like is Bitcoin as a data availability layer going to be practical? Is it going to be is it are users going to be able to take on the burden of that cost because it's going to become prohibitively expensive in the future? So when we use alternative data availability systems, like what is the trust assumption with that system? Like what are users taking on there? Are they trusting another consensus protocol? Are they trusting a federation? And then it gets like really, really murky, right? Like because you started with this like one trustless system and then you've worked your way back to like, oh, this has like some additional trust, so it's kind of like trust minimized, and then you work back even more, and then it's like, oh well, for specific applications, like we'll build their own blockchain and then they'll have like this like completely centralized blockchain. And I'm like, well, why do you need a block blockchain for that? Like just run some like centralized server and allow and just run like an execution environment in a centralized server and just have like maximum throughput and like super fast transactions and super low fees and just like if people just want to like gamble on it, just have people put their funds into that. So like when I started thinking about that type of problem, I started realizing that even like the side chains and the roll-ups and all these like new protocols coming to market are going to really struggle long term with scalability. So when you look at like side chains in particular, like I think a huge market that's going to come into play is roll-ups on top of side chains. So like for example, like Stacks, for example, right? Like Stacks has limited throughput relative to like its block size and the amount of data that's made available every X amount of minutes or X amount of seconds. So like if those blocks fill up and become very expensive to include transactions, users will then have to go to an alternative system, which might be like a roll-up or roll-up style blockchain on top of the Stacks blockchain. And to provide a better user experience, that chain is going to be more centralized than Stacks is, and Stacks is more centralized than Bitcoin. So like it's you're going down the stack constantly, and you're kind of like essentially building new scaling systems, and as the technologies get better, you kind of decentralize them as much as possible while maintaining like a good user experience and providing different trade-offs. But eventually down like continually down the stack, you're always going to have some centralized party that you're interacting with. So that's why like I started like thinking kind of in my personal time a lot more just about like Fedimints and eCash. So it's like, hey, if I'm gonna like interact with centralized systems anyways, right? If that's like the end game here, then yeah, then what's wrong with like using like a Fedimint where I like know the signers and know the people like securing the multi-sig and whatever, right? Like for me, like theoretically, like I'm just like there's no difference. So yeah, that's just something I've been thinking about a lot. Like there's always going to be like some trust assumption down the stack eventually when we get to this like millions and millions of people using these things and they're processing millions of transactions, billions of transactions with all this value and all this money. It's like users eventually are going to be put down to like some centralized system potentially, specifically to like the roll up and sidechain constructions. I know there's other scaling systems that are completely different. And I'm not talking about them, but like specifically to like the roll ups and sidechain stuff is where I spend most of my time. Like you do kind of see the path towards like more centralized systems more often than not. Um, so yeah, that's something I'm thinking about, and I could be very wrong, right? Like I used to work at a company that does like decentralized sequencers and high throughput data availability. Um, and there's some really like interesting use cases. Like you can build like new systems and new blockchains to like make different trade-offs and optimize for certain things. And you can do some like interesting constructions within those to like provide a lot more scalability. But ultimately, right, like I still do think like long term that people like might just prefer like using a chain that has like some centralized box and they're like
Yeah.
totally cool with that. So I think it's like where we're at right now specifically in Bitcoin, because like for example like the interoperability conversation related to new constructions, right, like and all these different design decisions, like we're so early, right? Like I think like there's nothing wrong with like comparing the trust assumption of like a centrally operated roll up with a federated two-way peg to like similarly as a Fedimint. In my opinion, they have like exactly the same trust assumption because the trust assumption ultimately lies with the bridge. But when these new like two-way pegs get constructed and you have more trust minimized designs, then I think it's like then it starts getting really interesting of like, okay, how much can we use Bitcoin for security? How much do these things actually scale? And that's like going to be a really interesting design space, and seeing like new solutions and techniques that people come up with is going to be really exciting. But yeah, like in the current state, like I am kind of at this point of like, okay, do these things scale? Are we going to be using centralized systems anyways? Like kind of what's the end game, right? So I'm kind of like 50-50 on it right now. But it's really fun to like look at every day. Sorry, that was a rant, but like yeah, TLDR is I
No,
do
man.
think yeah, I think a lot of this stuff ends up being centralized long term for specific application use cases. Um, and in that event, like, do we need to construct blockchains anyways? Is like kind of my question. So yeah, that's something
It's
I
a
think about.
great, I follow the logic. It makes sense to me. I mean, the basic premise is block. If you want to maintain decentralization, blockchains don't scale. Kind of full stop. And you can't build a more decentralized network that's more decentralized than the underlying network. So it's like if Bitcoin is
Mm,
this big, it's kind of like a pyramid that has to. You can't build a pyramid that goes like this and then goes back up bigger than the base. There's something about the assumption that's like it's not actually decentralized. There's a bottleneck there, and so your thinking is something like there's tech unlocks, and they could be trust minimized tech that allows less people to put their hands in the pot. And then there's the other side, which is that we lean into more human things, trust things, reputation things, brand things, and there's like a design there. It's almost like a tug of war. You optimize for both, but at some level you end up as you go up the stack and do more things on the above the base layer, you always run into the reputation and the trust piece. So you might as well optimize for that as well, which most people don't. They think it's all a tech unlock thing. And I think it sounds like you're
mm.
kind of saying there's also this regular ass human thing of like, do I trust, Tony G at Mutiny? Well, so far, yeah, he's built a great wallet and he's been like solid online. So like it's kind of like the Fedimint thing is leaning into that human aspect of it too, of like know who the circle is involved.
Yeah, exactly. And it's like, and when you, I mean, it's gonna get crazy. Like we're talking about L2s right now, but like people are gonna build there's going to be side chains, and then people are going to build roll-ups and different types of blockchains on top of side chains, and there's going to be different DA systems, and there's going to be different sequencers, and there's going to be different network constructions, and it's going to become a mess. And I think ultimately it's like, can we for the things that the end users are interacting with the most, like who are they trusting? Like, and who are the parties involved with operating the network and custodying their funds? And like, and that's why I think like this is a very interesting time because I feel like within like Bitcoin scaling specifically right now is like a lot of the teams specifically that are building roll-ups and validiums and side chains or whatever are kind of putting the cart before the horse, and they're saying like trust minimized to like trust minimize layer twos, and Bitcoin finance is like here, and like we're ready to like do all these things on Bitcoin. And I'm kind of like, that's great that we can do all these things, but like we are like this is no different than trusting. Like I don't see how this is any different than like using Liquid or Rootstock in like their current forms. And I think right now it's just like people kind of people not theoretically, like people are building this stuff, and like that there's a lot of like credit due there. Like people are building more trust minimized two-way peg constructions, and that I think is what is sparked the interest in all of this new investment. It's like we can build trust minimized side chains on Bitcoin. So therefore, if we can do it, this is going to be a new design space and unlock that I think a lot of people are really excited about. But right now, all the projects that are out and in production accepting user deposits don't have those types of trust minimized assumptions in place. So it's like, okay, like we are still like we can already do all the stuff on Rootstock. I don't understand why everyone is like freaking out, right? It's basically, you know, I would say even more centralized and not as reputationally
Yep.
not reputationally sound, but like they don't have as like long term of reputation as something like Rootstock does, for example. So I understand like a lot of the pessimism from the space as well, where people are like, "What the hell are all these new things? We could have done this for like the last like 2, 3, 4 years or whatever." So
Yeah,
I get
yeah,
it.
yeah. Makes sense. Okay. Man, we covered a lot. It's been fantastic. Last couple questions for you. Just kind of broadly, what are you most excited about right now? It could be something you're researching, anything in Bitcoin, like what's got you hyped up?
Um, I actually think like, and I'm not like I don't research this stuff a lot, and like I'm kind of hand waving right now, but like Alex B from Bitcoin Magazine wrote an article about like the modular stack of like Fedi mints and eCash mints and like all connecting with each other through Lightning. Um, I like think that's really interesting because like for example, like there's like an eCash wallet where you can like distribute your sats across like various mints, and then like you can like pay invoices from like 2 or 3 mints at the same time. Like I think that type of like application is really cool because it gives you like the centralized user experience of like Wallet of Satoshi, but additionally like allows you to distribute your trust across a number of parties, and I think that's like particularly useful for like really small payments. Um, so like I know a lot of people like really don't like the trust assumptions related to that stuff, but as someone who spends a lot of time researching like a lot of these new L2 constructions, I think that trust assumption is very similar to these new L2s or whatever, like specifically to Bitcoin, right? So like I'm not trying to like compare this to like other systems outside of Bitcoin. Um, so I think that's exciting, and I think those like there's a really cool developer community in that ecosystem, which I'm excited about. I think that a lot of the validity roll up or like BitVM style roll up constructions are going to be pretty cool. I know there's a lot of skepticism in that space. I fortunately like know a lot of the teams building in that space just through like interactions, and I think they're really smart people, and I think they're building really cool stuff. I'm not 100% convinced that an EVM style or compatible rollup will like um, steal users away from like Ethereum, for example. But I am excited about potential use cases that we can deploy specifically on these Bitcoin rollups, right? Like, so can we create better like borrowing and lending applications? Can we build better stablecoin infrastructure, and can we do it directly on Bitcoin? Can we do things like Zcash style, Monero style execution environments, like whether it's in a smart contract on an EVM chain, or is it like its own separate like roll up or L3 or L2 or whatever you want to call it? Um, I think that's pretty cool. And I think unlocking those use cases and exploring with the different types of virtual machines that are out there. So whether it be like the Cairo VM, I know that the Cortese team, they're like an optimistic roll-up construction in Ethereum with like a Linux-based virtual machine. Like they're interested in like Bitcoin stuff, and a lot of their teams contributed to BitVM. So I think like all of these like different design spaces that we're seeing like kind of in Ethereum and other ecosystems could potentially come over to Bitcoin. And I think like short term, a lot of it's going to get washed out. Long term, I think you get some really cool, interesting chains. And I think as long as like, yeah, designing that type of like system with using Bitcoin for like DA and inheriting some security properties from that, I think is really cool. And paying like DA fees to miners, I think it's interesting. Like I think things like botanics are pretty interesting too. So like they're like, oh, like we're gonna kind of reject this like roll up thesis, and kind of directly just try to build more decentralized side chains. Like I think that's pretty interesting. And I think like the application chain thesis on top of something like botanics, I know they've mentioned that in like podcasts. Like I know it kind of sounds crazy, but like L3s or whatever, again, I think that's pretty cool, because it gives a lot of developer flexibility and a lot of flexibility with the execution environment. Like you don't necessarily like Botanix is going to launch with a Rust implementation of the EVM. And I know like there are a lot of developers specifically like for their own application, like let's think of like gaming or something of that nature. Like they don't want to be constrained specifically by the EVM. They want something more flexible. So which is why they might want to develop with like a different execution layer, which is why they want to like build like their own chain, for example. Um, I think that like theoretically sounds pretty cool. It's crazy and it's nuts, but if it like you can pull that off, like that's really cool. Like if everyone can build like their own app chain and like interoperates and like they have sovereignty over their own chain in some form or fashion, but they can like communicate with other chains. That's pretty cool. I think that's like long term kind of crazy, but I think like theoretically that sounds neat. And then lastly, like more short term, I think like the application chain thesis on Bitcoin is interesting. So for example, like Mezzo and Bob specifically are like, yeah, we're gonna build something that's ready right now, and we're gonna kind of add the more Bitcoin oriented security tech on later. So it's like, yeah, let's build like an Ethereum rollup that abstracts all the way the complexity of using these applications and makes it feel like it's a Bitcoin chain. Like I think like even though like people will be like, that's not Bitcoin, it's not whatever. Like I think from a go-to-market perspective,
Mm.
that is really interesting. And I think like Mezzo is another one. Like, no, we're just gonna build Tendermint, we're gonna have pretty fast blocks. We're gonna use TBTC, which is like this battle-tested like two-way peg mechanism that they developed. We're gonna bring it all together and we're gonna build this like application chain. And it's like, you know what? You know, as much as I like to theorize about rollups and decentralization and all this stuff, like that's pretty cool. And that's like building for something that exists today. And yeah, I think that is like an interesting. Those are the things. Like so, basically everything. Sorry,
I was
that
gonna
is a
say,
short. That is a long way to say everything. I'm
yeah,
excited for a lot of the peer-to-peer, like the not yeah, a lot of the use cases that enable um quote unquote like cypherpunk banking and localized banking with Fedimints and eCash. I think that's cool. I think everything from the sidechain space is really interesting. And that there are teams, like I know a lot of people get like negative about it, but there are teams building really cool stuff. So yeah, I'm excited about everything. And I just wanted to give like a few specific examples and explain why.
no, it's super helpful because especially, I mean, I knew what you just said, all those things, because I'm pretty deep in the weeds. Most people probably aren't, so like it's very
Yeah.
cursory. So yeah, it's good to know. We're definitely in the experimentation phase, and like there's no clear winners. That's like the main thing. So we don't know which one's gonna win out. It's probably gonna be a combination of all the above, especially as they kind of like start to talk to each other and there's like interoperability amongst different standards, for example, where it's like
Mhm.
now there's this thesis that like Lightning is more of like a glue between networks, for example. It's not like this end all be all but buy your coffee thing unless you're gonna go custodial. Um, so yeah, bolting on, like you said, the cashew mints and the multi-mint payment, huge implications. Like that's seeing that diagram of it funneling from three different places into one is like there's so much you can do with that that it's hard to even wrap your head around. And then as you can layer on like algorithms and AI to like make it more efficient, or maybe that mint can go here and that mint can go over there because they're route like all kinds of things.
Mhm.
So yeah, all that's to say that we're definitely in the early innings, which is interesting. Um, yeah. Nothing else to add actually on that. Do you have any closing thoughts? Question I didn't ask that you want to bring it home with?
Yeah, I think the big thing is like everyone right now, right? Like this is a very weird time and very weird like space, I think, in scaling Bitcoin or adding new functionalities to Bitcoin, etc. I would just like encourage everyone to like there's a lot of information out there and I would just get it from as many places as possible, right? Like I think everyone kind of like focuses on like their own specific domain. Like so I like, look at side chains a lot and like talk about sequencers all the time and like that's like a very niche thing, right? So when I like go to Lightning, I have like a few like main people that I like want to like speak to or want to like read from because like that's like the domain that they're specifically focused in and similar to like Fedamine and eCash, whatever. I think there's just like so much stuff going on right now. It is going to seem like a whirlwind, but it's a really fun time and it's really exciting. And I do ultimately think that like a lot of the stuff like that's being developed, like it is a scam. Like I would say 95%, especially like in the new sidechain roll up type space. Like I think 95% of it's a scam. But I think that past that, when you can move past this like kind of crazy time, like you are going to end up with like these really cool applications and really cool chains and really cool um, new designs that will allow you to either make using your Bitcoin more easy for like payments or just unlocking new functionalities. So I think that approach it with like some skepticism, but at the same time, right? Like it's a really optimistic time, and I think that um, there's a lot of fun stuff that's going to come of this, and I think it's just going to be like a messy for a couple of years, but long term, it's going to be really cool. And I think that like when we look at these chains, the competitor is not each other. The competitors are systems like Ethereum and
Hmm.
Solana, and it's like yeah, like kind of thinking past it, like oh, like the roll up is trying to take users away from like Lightning. Like I don't think that's the case. Like no, we're trying to like, and even though I might not be completely convinced that like an EVM compatible roll up on Bitcoin will steal or will take users from like an Ethereum roll up, right? I still think that building that is something like worth doing and seeing like if, like you can compete in the market and users do they value using Bitcoin as a native asset more than other chains and more than other assets and like yeah, I think that's pretty cool. I think it's a really interesting design space. I'm kind of excited for it.
Love it. Well said. All right. To close this out, people have been deluded with all this information. You should listen back to this, educate yourself. But if they want to go check out Bitcoin Layers or check out you, where should they go to learn more?
Yeah, I'm mainly on Twitter. So at Janusz G underscore, so JANUSZG underscore. That's my Twitter. I basically just talk about new side chains all day. That's kind of boring. Bitcoin Layers is at Bitcoin Layers on Twitter, and our website is bitcoinlayers.org. And we're going to be doing some stuff related to like newsletters and media and stuff like that, trying to like outline all these new systems. So yeah, those are the main places to follow me and follow Bitcoin Layers, and we'll start getting on other apps like Noster and other communication channels as well in the near future.
Perfect. I'll have links below, make it easier on people listening. Uh, but man, thank you for coming on, for dropping knowledge, and doing what you're doing. Appreciate it, Giannis.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you for listening this far into the episode. If you found it enjoyable, please do like, subscribe on whatever platform that you're listening on. YouTube does me a huge favor to like and subscribe. Find me on Twitter at Jake Blockchain. Show me some love. I reply to every DM. And if you are a Bitcoin builder that is kind of at the forefront of building new use cases, whether it's L1, Lightning, Stacks, Rootstock, Rollups, Ordinals, BRC20, I want to talk to you. So when I'm not doing this podcast, I am the sourcing partner at the Bitcoin Frontier Fund, where we invest in Bitcoin startups at the earliest stages, give you access to whatever you need, whether it's legal, product, fundraising help, as well as capital. So love to talk to you. You can hit me up again. Find me on Twitter at Jake Blockchain. and shoot me a DM. I'll read everything. Love to talk to you guys. All right, peace.
It's gone up. We playing the long game to the black rock chains with the racks paid off from the blockchain. Going up high octane, so we up in here like pomade. Making big noise, big money, go play with your kid toys. You funny, I'm counting my Bitcoin. We up and we been gone. It's gone. Planned it out and we did this purposefully. Panning out like the kitchen currently. It's like surgery, way it's earning me a nurse's salary for cryptocurrency. I'm on a vacay drinking coconuts while wearing polka dots. This ain't no hocus pocus, listen up and learn. It's gone up.